the Pentagon. I'm at our facility at Marine Barracks, Washington. So this is my office.
Excellent.
I'm on a rotating schedule, so I'm home on every other day, and we have basically two teams to try to stay away from each other. And if anybody gets sick, we continue with our readiness. So that's the plan. So today is an office day.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us. It's quite a treat to hear from you and about your experiences with the Marine Band and just in general with your career as a musician, as a conductor, and a clarinetist. And I thought maybe we could start off by just giving a brief background about yourself as a musician and what led to where you are currently today.
Sure. I'm a clarinetist by trade, so I actually joined the Marine Band as a clarinet player. We have a unique system in the President's Zone where most of our directors actually come from within the organization, which is a little different than the way the Army and the Air Force run their programs, where they actually go out and recruit conductors who then immediately become officers and then never players in the bands. But in the President's Zone, we were all players in the bands or on the staff before we came in. So I played clarinet from a very early age. From second grade, I started pretty early and stuck with it throughout my entire secondary education. Decided to major in music relatively late, actually, not until my senior year in high school. And I had, music was a huge part of my life, but I hadn't really necessarily considered doing it for a living until I was about to go to college. And at that point, I went to UMass Amherst for music education and was really excited about the idea of teaching music. I was going to be a band director, not the kind of band director I am right now. That was not necessarily in the plan. Nobody could have ever anticipated that. But I was excited about teaching band, and I added a performance degree once I got there, and just kind of kept my options open. But I didn't really have an intention of playing clarinet for a living. I wanted to be a conductor, and I was going to go to graduate school right away for conducting. Got to my senior year of college and had finished all my coursework, and all I had left was my student teaching, which I was going to do in the fall. And over that summer of 1997, I played clarinet in a group called the American Wind Symphony, which is a pretty famous professional band that plays every summer for years. It's called the Barge Band, out of Pittsburgh, conducted by Robert Boudreau, who I'm sure you know. Did it for 70 years practically. So this is a fantastic experience to play every day, practice a lot, really play with other great players from colleges all over the country. And as that tour was ending in the summer of 97, I accidentally stumbled upon a newsletter for the United States Marine Band. And I didn't know a lot about the President's Zone other than it was a famous band. But I turned it over, and it happened on the back of the newsletter was an announcement for an opening for clarinet. And so I thought, I'd never taken a professional audition before. I thought I would call away for the music and get it to me and just see if I was qualified to play the music. I had no idea even if the music would be too hard for me or what the expectations would be. So got the music, and for the last couple weeks of that tour, I practiced a couple hours a day, and got home, and the audition was later that week. I had not bought a plane ticket, and I made the decision that I was not going to go to the audition because I didn't feel like I was ready. I didn't want to fail. I didn't want to make a fool of myself. And so I decided not to go, and I was going to go on my merry way and go student teach and go on to graduate school. And my parents said, "Why don't you go to take that audition? If they're gonna hear you, if they're gonna let you come, why wouldn't you just take a chance? You never know. If you don't play the lottery, you don't win the lottery, right?" So at the very last minute, I decided to pull my pants up and to go and be courageous and go take that audition. And at the end of that day, I won that audition. It's just crazy to think about it. To me, I even remember being very intimidated by so many of the people I heard warming up in the room. I thought, this is way out of my league. I should not be here. And so to win the audition and be offered a position in the President's Zone was a dream come true about a dream I didn't even know I had, to be a professional clarinet player in a group like this. So I accepted the job, and I thought, I'll just see what it's like. Maybe I'll enjoy it. Maybe it'll change my entire expectation of my career. My one concern was that I was not going to be able to finish my education degree, but the band actually let me finish my student teaching. So I went in the fall of 97. I student taught middle school band in Lexington, Massachusetts, had a great time. And then as soon as I was finished with that, I reported to Washington and started my career as a clarinet player. Within a year of being in the band, I loved it. I mean, the musicianship was amazing, as you can imagine. I've never heard anything like it, being in the middle of that clarinet section. I loved the history. Being at the White House was incredible. The kind of traditions we were upholding. I liked the Marine Corps. I enjoyed the kind of the identity of being a Marine as well, and that kind of service aspect. And so I decided I was going to probably stay as a clarinet player, and I was going to change my entire perception of what I was going to do. No more conducting, no more teaching, just playing clarinet. And then 3 years into my career in the band, one of the assistant directors retired, and Colonel Tim Foley, the 26th director of the band, decided to hold an open audition. And he explicitly said that anybody who wanted to audition could do so, no matter how long they've been in the band. It had traditionally been people appointed after 10, 12 years in the band. They were appointed to the junior assistant director position, and kind of they already had some experience. So it was an open invitation to audition. And I thought the worst that could happen is I get a chance to conduct my colleagues in an audition and have some fun driving the Ferrari a little bit. So I threw my hat in the ring and went through a rigorous process that lasted a couple of weeks. And at the end of that process, for whatever reason, Colonel Foley decided to pick me. And so another shotgun change in my career, going from a professional clarinet player, something I thought I was getting good at and that I was confident in, to now becoming a leader and a conductor in this band, both of which I had no experience and no confidence in. I had done some conducting in college and high school. I had some experience, but nothing at the professional level, and certainly nothing like this. So the learning curve was pretty steep for me to be a young person in the band with not a lot of clout or credibility, and then also to learn how to conduct this organization, learn how to be a good leader. Spent 13 years as an assistant director, working my way up the ranks and just gaining experience and gaining some confidence and making mistakes and learning from those mistakes. And then in 2014, when my predecessor, Mike Colburn, retired to go be director of bands at Butler University, I became the 28th director of the band. So that path from not even knowing if I was qualified to join the band and not even thinking that this was even an opportunity for me, from that to now being the director of this band, it feels almost unbelievable. And it kind of, the lesson for me was that when you have those opportunities, take them, because you never know what you're capable of until you try. And B, you can make all the plans you want in the world, but you're often going to end up in a completely different place than you've envisioned yourself or that you see yourself. And in many cases, it'll be a much better place. I mean, I can't even imagine, I could never have planned for this opportunity, but I can't imagine anything better than the job that I'm entrusted to do and that I have an opportunity to do. And so I just was open to those options, and it led me to this path. So I'm very grateful for it.
Wow, that's a fantastic journey, and it is incredible how it can deviate from what you had originally planned for. Do you feel as though the conducting path in the Marine Band is better for overall kind of player, I guess, buy-in, if you will, versus like maybe the Air Force or Army, where they hire outside of the musicians?
I do think that there are advantages and disadvantages. I think the advantages absolutely are cultural and experience and credibility wise. Even though I said I didn't have a lot of credibility as a conductor when I started, that is true. But I had the support of my colleagues because they knew me as a person and as a professional. And I did have the musical credibility of having won an audition to play in the band. So I had walked a mile in their shoes. That's been a huge part of the leadership buy-in, and my job is for them to understand that I know what it's like to do their job. The empathy part of it is really huge. And then I had the musical credibility. Even though my conducting, I had a lot to learn. They knew I was a good musician. I had proven myself on the musical front, and that really helped as well. And then culturally, just being in the Marine Corps, being in this band, understanding what we do, why we do it, how we do it, and how to speak that language, you can't teach that. You have to experience it. You have to go through it yourself. And so if I were to come in as a very seasoned conductor, cold, having all the skills on the podium, but not having any of the idea about the cultural traditions of the band, not having any idea how to be an officer in the Marine Corps, not having any kind of musical credibility other than waving my hands around, I might have been more successful right out of the gate on the technical front, but I would have been far less successful on the leadership front and on the understanding how this band makes music. So I think that's a huge advantage. That continuity is a huge, huge advantage. The disadvantage, of course, is the candidate pool is fairly small. We're not doing a nationwide search and considering 40 well-trained conductors. We're considering musicians who have an interest in maybe a natural talent conducting, but in many cases don't have the experience or the degrees in that. Now, I went back and got a master's degree in orchestral conducting after the fact. As soon as I became assistant director, I freaked out and thought, okay, I have to be bona fide, and I have to get more help. So I was doing both jobs. I was doing my job as an assistant director and I was also a full-time master's student at the same time. And those experiences were really helpful to me. I had the best lab band in the world, it was really incredible to come off of my classes and my lessons and the opera work I was doing in graduate school, and then come conduct the Marine Band and experiment and try out new things with my colleagues. So that's the disadvantage, that maybe you don't have as much experience or as much kind of a candidate pool that's wider. But I think that the history of the band, choosing its directors, and the success that this organization has had for 200 years proves that this system, as imperfect as it is, actually has tremendous advantages to it.
Wonderful. You mentioned about going to the University of Maryland for your graduate degree in orchestral conducting. Was that with Mark Anthekar or? Um,
It was actually with Jim Ross. So Jim Ross had gotten there right the year before I started my degree with him. And he's since moved on. He's now the music director of the Alexandria Symphony, but he was there for quite a number of years.
So we have a couple of questions from students that kind of relate to this path of choosing the orchestral conducting route. In our class, we have about 21 students, and 5 of those are orchestral string players, and then the rest are wind and percussion students. And we're all getting certified in teaching, whether it's band or orchestra, as an instrumental educator. And so there's some apprehension, certainly rightfully so, for the wind and percussion students. What kind of advice, and Emily Jones, why don't you jump in here with your question, if you will, please?
Yeah, so I was wondering how you learn about relaying information to string players when you're not really a string player yourself. Like, how do you know the information about like what you want them to do with your bows and articulations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's like learning a new language. And it's really not a whole lot different. We all play an instrument, and I probably knew more about trombone than I did about violin when I started this job, but it's still a completely different language and a completely different skill set. So I think as conductors, we just have, it's a necessary evil. We're going to know more about some instruments than others. And our job, of course, is to learn as much as we can about every instrument in our ensembles, whether it's an orchestra or a band. Not so that you can tell, especially in my case, my professionals how to do their jobs. I'm certainly never going to do that. But it's more out of the empathy at the professional level of understanding what it takes to do what they do on those instruments in a general sense. I think that's really important, to know that whatever you're asking for as a conductor, it's reasonable, and that if it's hard or difficult in a general sense. And I think that connects you to your musicians much better. On a teaching level, if you're trying to teach, you need to know more about the technique on a fundamental level, because you're going to be helping those instrumentalists learn their instruments. They're not professionals. They're still learning their craft. And depending on what level you're teaching, you may be doing more or less of that. And so that just it doesn't require you to be an expert at that instrument. You don't need to play trombone or French horn or cello really well, but you do need to understand kind of what it takes to do to play those instruments and have a rudimentary ability. This is why we take our instrumental techniques classes when we get a music ed degree. So you have a semester of playing trumpet if you're a flute player. You have a semester of playing, French horn. And those, I think all of us have varying degrees of success. I took to some instruments better than others. But when I went over to strings, and so I took some string techniques classes in college, but mostly wind and brass classes. When I started conducting strings, I tried to do as much reading as I could, reading, Norman Del Mar's, book, just his kind of anthology on instrumental techniques, and learning the language, learning what the difference was between spiccato and staccato and different bowing techniques. Not so I could show off for the orchestra and say, look, I know the technical terms for this, but just so if I wanted something, I could speak their language, and that they knew that I was asking for something that I knew theoretically what it entailed to make that happen. And then talking to professional string players, I was definitely not shy, and still am not shy, about talking to my colleagues and saying, can you tell me a little bit more about this? Can you show me what the difference is between these bowing techniques? Can you show me, when you shift for this piece of music, what are the different things that you do? Why would you play this all on the G string rather than playing it across and do crossings? If you know that stuff by talking to the professionals, you get an arsenal in your conductor language that allows you just enough of that language and that knowledge to be able to speak meaningfully to your professionals and speak in a language that they will understand and is as efficient as possible. And the last thing I'll say on that is that I've also not been shy of just talking in musical terms, especially to string players when I don't really know exactly how they're going to execute something. There's nothing wrong with just saying, can you play that shorter or soft or longer? You don't have to get into terms about on the string or off the string. They'll take care of that. And with professionals, with students, you might be a little bit more of that kind of teaching. But there are times I'm saying, look, I just want that shorter. However you execute that, my concert master will make those decisions. And I don't feel embarrassed that I don't necessarily know every nuance of what they would do. And in some cases, they would prefer me not to get too far into the weeds with telling them how to do their jobs. They just want they want to know what the end result needs to be, and then rely on them to do it. So it's a mix of those two things. Sometimes I speak in their language with what I've learned and what I know. Sometimes I try to back off and let them just do what the intent is and do it in whatever way makes the most sense to them as experts.
Wonderful, thank you. We've got a couple of students and potentially even more that are interested in kind of pursuing their conducting career as orchestral conductors, but start off as wind players. One here is Charlie Anderson, who conducted your Marine Band back a few years ago for the Young Conductor contest with MBA. And then Elijah, maybe you can ask your question about pursuing this.
Yeah, so my question was, as a wind player pursuing an orchestral conducting degree, what was your biggest challenge, and what advice would you give to other wind players who are interested in that path?
There were a couple of challenges conducting wise. The first one was what we were just talking about, just feeling confident in front of string players that you were not a poser, that you were not a faker, that you actually did know, not only know the repertoire, but also know kind of what it takes for them to make sound. And that just takes experience and just going through it and just years of being on the podium and just having that confidence and doing the study, and really reading and making sure you're talking to experts and absorbing that information. No one ever expects a clarinet player to be able to pick up the fiddle and play, the fourth movement of Tchaik 4. I mean, it's just, no one's going to expect you as a conductor to do that. They expect you more to be a decent pianist. That's the one instrument other than your instrument that you should spend time on. But they do expect you to understand what it is to be in their world. And so that was a challenge, just to not feel like I was faking it. I didn't want to fake it. I wanted to speak authentically and speak with like someone who had been in front of an orchestra enough to be able to talk to my colleagues in a way that was knowledgeable. The second challenge was more nuanced. It's this idea of, is there a difference between how you conduct a band and how you conduct an orchestra? And the answer for me to that question is yes and no. I think on a musical level, the answer is no. You should never think about conducting a band differently than conducting an orchestra. I don't conduct, in a fundamental sense, the two ensembles we have here, my chamber orchestra, my band, any differently. I have tried to come up with a toolbox in my conducting gestures and in my sensibilities that works with every kind of musician, whether they're winds or brass or percussion or strings. The yes part of that is that it is true that in that toolbox, you should have gestures and ideas that are specifically catered to certain instruments when they need them. So the way I conduct a pizzicato is very specific. I will conduct a pizzicato in an idea that will help them, not only the shape of what they're doing, to kind of mimic the shape of what they do to create that sound, but also to show what kind of resonance I want after that. That's a skill and a tool that I did not have before I started conducting strings. So I have added some things to my repertoire that I specifically came about and were inspired by conducting strings. When I was with Jim in my graduate degree, we talked a lot about, and I'm a big advocate of this, talked a lot about how do the instruments make sound physically, and how can you represent that physically in your conducting. And so with string players, of course, there's a lot of horizontal sound that happens here. They make sound with their bow. And they make sound with the vibrato in their left hand. So in order for you to get a certain sound out of some strings, it does make sense for you to mimic some of that physical presence. It doesn't make as much sense to conduct lyrical string music vertically. But I also found, this is the interesting part, that it actually makes just as much sense to conduct winds that way as well. There's a lot of times I will use my string gestures as a conductor and my string terminology even to get the kind of sound that I want out of my wind players. So even though they're not making sound the same way, if you physically embody that sound in a horizontal way, the way you would with strings, you can get some of the same effect from those wind players. They have to work harder to do it than the strings do in certain types of music because of the mechanics of their instruments, but they can actually do that. And I think it does actually get a different sound out of the ensemble. The same way, like, Stravinsky doesn't land well in orchestra. Stravinsky is generally very difficult for string players to play because it's spiky and it's vertical and there's not a lot of lyricism that's extended. It's very different than Brahms, but that doesn't mean you would conduct Stravinsky differently with an orchestra than you will with the band. You're going to conduct the music of Stravinsky, and you're going to do whatever it takes physically to get the sound you need out of those instruments, depending on what you're seeing on the score. That answers your question.
That was fantastic. You briefly mentioned about using the piano. Is that something that you believe strongly in as part of the conducting score study process?
I do. For me, I think it's a very personal process. I mean, you certainly need to develop your skill at score reading without the piano or without recordings or anything. I think it's a really important skill to be able to look at a score and within reason, be able to see the harmonies, be able to hear kind of harmonic motion, certainly melodic motion, structure, texture. But I'm a very tactile person, and I love the idea of sitting, especially with a new piece that there is no reference and we're learning for the first time, to be able to sit down at the piano. And I'm not a great pianist, but I practice and I try to get better. But it's great to from a tactile perspective, to do your transpositions on real time and to practice that way in addition to your technique. And I just love playing things on the piano slowly, just playing chords and textures and playing melodies and singing one melody and playing another one. It's great training for me, and it really gets the sound inside my body. When I sit down and I play the harmonic motion of an 8-bar phrase in a new piece, I can look at it and I can generally hear it in my mind, but I can really hear it once I feel it in my body. And then it's it gets inside me. And so when I hear the band or the orchestra play it, not only do I know what to expect orally when I'm looking at the score, I know what I should be hearing, but I feel what I should be hearing too. And I learn the piece so much better when I can physically get involved in it. So I do spend, when I have the time, I spend a lot of time at the keyboard, just fiddling around and just trying different things. It's the idea when you mark a score, it's the same way when, they say when you take notes in class, you're not necessarily going to read those notes. The act of taking the notes, you're absorbing the material because you're physically having to do something that connects with your synapses. Same thing happens for me with music. Whether I'm marking a score, I'm marking the score not to read the score in rehearsal or performance. Ultimately, the goal is not to have to do that. I'm marking it to learn it. I'm marking it to internalize in my head and to get that visual kind of sense of what I'm seeing. So when I turn a page, I'm not only seeing the score, I'm seeing my markings, and that helps me to absorb it. Same thing with the piano. When I play a phrase 4 or 5 times and I play those chords 4 or 5 times, then not only am I hearing the chord, I'm feeling it in my fingers. And I guess I have I'm kind of a visual learner. So I can sometimes see my hands on the piano when I'm conducting the band. I can see what that feels like. And that helps me to also, that opens up my ears in a weird way too. But it's a very personal thing. Some people may prefer not to use the piano and just do it all at their desk or just do it all through singing. The one thing you shouldn't do is only learn a score through recordings. I think recordings are helpful. I would never say that, hey, don't you dare listen to a recording when you're studying. I think if that's a way to get those sonorities in your ear and to kind of get the textures in your ear, fine, use it as a tool. Just be real careful, of course, that you don't learn your interpretations through recordings. It's better to listen to 5 or 6 different recordings if you're using them for study. And it's better to bring in the recordings later in the process after you've spent a good amount of time without the recordings or at the piano, and then the recording just becomes a supplement rather than where you've started. That's how I would use recordings when I do use them and when they're available.
Do you have any other kind of advice regarding the score study process that you didn't mention just in the last little bit?
Yeah, it's also very personal. I'm definitely a macro to micro studier, so I don't want to start on page 1 and go that way. I want to start by getting a sense of the whole thing. So I generally have, if I had to put a number on it, there are probably about 5 passes through a score as I'm studying. Pass 1 is just the overall architecture. What is the shape of this piece? What's the big picture stuff? What is the composer trying to say on a macro level? Phase 2 is when I start getting into some of the phrase structure. Now we're talking about kind of forms of the different movements, a little bit of micro phrase structure, kind of how is it built? How do these sections come back? Is it a sonata form? Is it a rondo? Is it kind of just through composed? I want to know those things in my second pass. The third pass is when I start to get into now melodic material. So where are the themes? Where's the counterpoint? Where's the kind of development of those themes? Just totally melodic and just shape of kind of the main themes. The fourth pass would be harmonic then. Now we're talking about, okay, now we're going to get into the weeds on kind of where are the major harmonic key centers, where are the harmonic shifts, how does the harmony serve the melody and the form, where are the differences? You know, if this section comes back, if it's an ABA thing and the A section comes back, how is it different both melodically, form-wise, and harmonically? And that's where you get into like the differences. You know, like in Rite of Spring, you know, it's this crazy thing, like in the dance, the famous dance, jump, bump, 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 bump. Those chords, you would never be able to hear that they're different. Like some of the chords are different by 1 or 2 notes, and there's no reason for that to be different. Like you can't really hear it unless you're really listening carefully. The regular listener would not hear it, and yet you wonder why are they different. But you'd never know that there's little chords are different if unless you went in there with a scalpel and you kind of circled those and figured those out. So when I have the time to do that kind of study, I love finding those little Easter eggs, finding those things that on a surface level, no one would ever know. You could never rehearse that and it wouldn't matter, but it's there in the score. It's worthy of acknowledgement if you can find it and you can kind of know it. And that's a level of knowledge in the piece that's so valuable because it really tells you that you have gotten to that level where you really are absorbing every aspect of this piece, not just enough to be able to conduct it and rehearse it, which is a level that frankly, a lot of us are at sometimes when we're crunched for time or we have too much music to learn. You can't get down into the weeds for everything, but when you are able to, that fourth pass for me is when I start to get into those weeds. And then the fifth pass is when I start to really make those musical decisions. But my musical decisions on kind of how I want to interpret the score, where I want to change, you know, the expressive elements of it are hopefully, ideally informed by everything I've learned up to that point. They're informed by the architecture, they're informed by the structure, they're informed by the melodic material and how it's developed. They're informed absolutely by the harmony. Unless I know all of that stuff and I've kind of gone through it and kind of put that in my body first, it's very difficult for me to make really good musical decisions. And the interesting thing about this, the reason I know this works is because I've come back to pieces in my career, you know, famous pieces we all know, we've conducted, and my interpretation has changed because I finally had the chance after the third or fourth time to get into those weeds and discover some things that not radically, but some things that markedly alter my interpretation that I just missed the first 2 or 3 times I performed it. And it's been a kind of a cool kind of epiphany to say, oh, this is here. I didn't even notice this before. And now I'm thinking differently about how I want to conduct this phrase or where I want it to go or how I want to break it up. And that's been nice to be able to revisit those pieces and feel like I'm not just rehashing the same thing over and over again. It's the 5th time through the Hindeman Symphony or Linkachara Posey, but it's actually a new piece because I'm in a different place in my career. I'm in a different place in my experience, and I'm discovering new things about it that are affecting the way I conduct it.
Wonderful. Sarah Einberger, why don't you jump in here? You and Haley both had kind of similar questions, but Sarah, why don't you ask your question about nerves?
I asked, what are some techniques that you use to calm your nerves before you conduct a performance?
Yeah, you know, nerves are something we can't get rid of. And I think the important thing to take stock of when you're nervous, whether you're nervous as a performer in an audition or you're conducting, is why are you nervous? You know, you can't stop the nerves because we're human beings and we're all going to be nervous, but you have to ask yourself, why are you nervous? And I think generally, at least for me, and I think a lot of you may share this, the reason we get nervous is because we're worried about being judged. Whether being judged by an audience if we screw something up, or being, in most cases, being judged by our peers, by our band. You know, we're up there for all the world to see on the podium. Everything we say is being scrutinized, for better or for worse. Everything we do is being judged, and it's hard. And nobody wants to fail. Nobody wants to be seen as not competent. The problem is that the process of getting better at what you do necessitates the fact that you are not going to be as competent now as you will continue to be the more experience you have. And so to a degree, dealing with the nerves is just dealing with the reality of the situation, and just and also dealing with what's the idea of what is the worst that can happen. The only reason I took the Marine Band audition is because I was able to convince myself that I wasn't going to die. And even if I didn't win, what was going to change? Nothing was going to change. I was going to go on to the next day and do what I was going to do anyway. But I still felt like I had to climb a mountain to get to that place mentally where I was willing to put myself out there and take a chance. My nerves are still there. I still get nervous for things, but these days, I get nervous for things that I have not done very much. The reason I don't get as nervous as I used to on the things that I do a lot is because I can tell myself in my own private moments that I've done that before, I've had success, it's going to be okay. I've done my work, I'm prepared. Why would I fail this time when I've had success in the past? And that confidence, that kind of self-generated confidence, that kind of talking yourself up has really helped me to stay calm in situations. Even in situations that are new now, where I might be a little bit nervous or apprehensive, I try to relate it to things that I've done before that were similar, that I've been okay and I've had success and I'm qualified to do. And it helps calm me down a little bit. So I get more nervous nowadays rather than conducting, because I know my musicians very well. I've conducted obviously thousands of times in public. I'm not as nervous about that, but I get nervous about big ceremonies or big things like at the White House that need a little bit of improvisation. That I have to make some decisions, and I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to do it right. The kind of more choreography of my job makes me more nervous now than the stuff that I've done a million times, because I know how to do it and I feel good about it. It's the things I'm not as confident about that make me nervous. And I think I've made a direct connection between those things in my life. But I also tell myself in those situations, what's the worst that can happen? Somebody's got to do it, and theoretically what you're supposed to do, and you've done your work and your preparation. And, if mistakes happen, they happen. You can't be perfect, but the worst scenario in all these situations is actually not a very bad scenario. When you compare it to, especially what we're going through now, just having this situation and having to deal with this kind of stress and all the people that are, of course, sick and the stress they're going through. So it's a long-winded answer to say that, yes, you get nervous. We all get nervous, but the more experience you have, the more times you do something and the more successes you have, those nerves will start to quiet down. And then when they don't, just tell yourself that you can do it, and then try to find some other like experience that you've gone through that you've had success in, and bring those two things together in your mind, and it'll help you.
Great, thank you for that answer. As you just mentioned, this whole situation for everybody, musicians, whatever it may be, has been challenging for us, and particularly for college students that are training to be conductors and future music educators, and losing out on this experiential opportunity. Olivia, why don't you ask your question that is directly related to this?
I'm trying to remember my exact question and the way I worded it, but I think it was something along the lines of, what can we as aspiring educators and conductors do during, this time when we're so used to a hands-on environment? And I know a lot of us obviously learn better that way. Do you have any advice or tips on what we should practice while we're by ourselves right now and can't be in that environment?
Yeah, we're all of our worlds have been turned completely upside down, and it's scary, not only because you're missing out on really valuable experiences, especially for the seniors that are among you, but also we're not sure what the future holds. Like, none of us really knows what this is going to look like on the other end of this crisis, for us as professional musicians, as teachers, as performers. As far as your question, Olivia, about your education, one of the things that there's two things that I think have been good about this situation. One is, I think it's opened all of our eyes up to the possibilities of what we're doing right now. Resources and things to learn that we may not have sought out before because we have it all at our fingertips in our programs or in our workplaces. So, there's so much stuff out there. We're living in a time, thank goodness, where there's so much. So to find the stuff that really has inspired you, the stuff that you're really curious about, and just go and spend your time looking for that. I've learned so much as a conductor just by watching other conductors and by listening to them talk to their orchestras and their bands on video, just recordings, watching great conductors rehearse and physically watching them and just saying, wow, that was such a cool way to embody that sound. Let me practice that, So there is a lot that can be learned from that, just seeking out that information. The other thing I think that we can do in this time, we're all so busy all the time. We're all just running from place to place, you know, another paper to be written, another class to study for, another piece to learn, another lesson to prepare for. Now that that's not a big part of our daily lives, I think we have some space to think creatively, you know, to think about what your future looks like and what kinds of things you want to do, what kind of projects would be interesting to you, and to just start working on that now. Maybe you always wanted to study the music of a certain thing and write a paper about it. It's not an assignment, but maybe you could start jotting some things down and start coming up with some ideas. You know, come up with your doctoral dissertation ideas now, so that when you get to that point, you've got 4 or 5 ideas that you're really cool about, because you took this time when you had the time to think about it, and some spark went off in your mind. So I would say, be really careful to not waste this time by being sorry for ourselves, which is very easy to do, but look at it as an opportunity to actually fill that space with some meaningful research and some meaningful creativity.
I like that, Dr. Bowman. We look forward to reading your dissertation in about 12 years.
Yeah, my 4th graders are going to love that.
Courtney Buss, why don't you chime in with your question here?
I had 3 questions, so I don't know which one you're talking about.
Sorry, overachiever here. Just the first question about getting more confident and showing expression despite the pattern.
Oh, yeah. So, what do you think is something that we can do in our practice to like get more confident in showing expression and getting out of the pattern as opposed to just sitting there beating time?
Yeah, this is the fundamental question for conductors, right? You hit right in the core of what we all struggle with and what we all worry about. We could talk all day about this. This is like a separate thing, but I think in a nutshell, expressive conducting first and foremost requires us to be vulnerable. And it's especially weird for me. I'm in a Marine Corps uniform and I'm in a straitjacket when I conduct on the stage. It's very strange to feel vulnerable as a Marine colonel. I mean, just the two don't go together. But I do think that I'm at my best as a conductor when I am willing to embody the music in whatever way that means physically, and not be worried about what that means to people watching it. And in the sense of not be worried about being judged. I think the best conductors are the ones who, they're like dancers. Their body is the vehicle of the expression, and they're going to be emotional in front of their ensembles. They're going to be honest. They're going to be authentic. And I think to a degree that drives the train on the physical gesture. You know, I think rather than plan out like, hey, I'm going to stop beating time here and I'm going to be more expressive, I think that's not as productive as just being open to what your body needs to do to be expressive, and then let it deviate from the pattern in those places. Now, the caveat here, of course, is that different ensembles need different things. So your number one job as a conductor is to make sure that you're giving your ensemble, to the best of your judgment in the moment, exactly what they need to do their jobs. Sometimes that's time. Sometimes that's clarity. Sometimes that's cues. Other times they don't need all that, and it is more expression. And our job as conductors is to shift back and forth between those worlds constantly. Now, at my level, with professional musicians, I have a lot more flexibility. I can do that at almost any time. They almost never need me to beat time. Almost never. Sometimes they do. So I have a lot more options. I have a lot more time where I can come in and out of those moments, and I can be more expressive for them, or I can just get out of the way altogether and just let them play. And it's a really cool feeling to be able to do that. But I do realize that most high school bands, middle school bands, you're not going to have that same luxury. I think as a teacher, or as an aspiring teacher, what you should aspire to is to empower your musicians at whatever level they're at to not need you all the time, so that not only can you practice that idea of expressive conducting, but it also makes them better musicians too, so they're not relying on you as a handicap for that time. In your education, I think my advice to you is to not only be true to yourself and take chances expressively, even if it means that you might be a little vulnerable to your musicians, but I would experiment. I think it's important to experiment. You know, you get to a place where you're conducting a piece in lab or whatever, and you say, you know, I think right here the band or the orchestra does not need time, and I think something really special can happen here dramatically. I'm gonna get some gestures in my toolbox that are gonna allow me to do that, and I'm gonna get away from that time. I will tell you that it feels very exposed when you do that, because it requires you, when you deviate from the time, you have to trust the ensemble to do what they need to do. And sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes the train comes off the rails. but that's an experiment. You know, you don't do that in performance. You do it in rehearsal and in lab. So, you know, okay, I got too far away from it. They needed me back there. But that trust factor is so hard to convince your body that I'm going to stop beating now and I'm going to show something else, or I'm going to go into an a la breve beat rather than a quarter note beat because that's better for the expression. That's the other thing about this. Is why I said we could talk all day on this. Expressive conducting doesn't mean deviating 100% from the beat. The beat should always be there somewhere in your body. It doesn't have to be in a pattern, but you should be showing that pulse somewhere in your body, physically manifesting that pulse. And just by something as simple as conducting to the half note or to the bar, you're still showing the pulse, but it's giving you a lot more room in between the beats to be expressive. So you can still keep time and be expressive. It's not an either or proposition. But I think the best conductors are the ones who are always thinking about how to add expression into their patterns, find patterns that allow them to be expressive, and just being as honest and as open and as vulnerable as you can be.
Wow, fantastic answer. We've had a number of questions here that I think we've answered. Are there any other questions from any of the participants that don't feel like they've been adequately answered for you? Or any other new questions before we may go on to something else here? Awesome. Colonel Fettig, would you like to maybe work with a couple of conductors, just like maybe on 16 measures of some of our pieces for the final exam?
Yeah, that would be great.
Awesome. Sammy, would you be so kind to go first?
Oh, I suppose.
Are you doing the chaconne?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So are you going to sing or audiate?
I'd prefer to audiate if that's
Okay.
okay.
Great. And just for sake of time, we'll just do those two iterations there.
Okay.
Good. So, Sammy, you have a nice pattern and good flow to what you're doing. It's very beautiful, and it's very much in keeping with the shape of the beginning of the chaconne. I think a couple things you can think about, and I know it's awkward on the Zoom and in the camera here, and this whole thing's awkward. Kudos to you for going first, by the way, because this is, I'm sure it's super weird. But one of the things that I think right away is, you know, we have these half notes every 4 bars, da dee da 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 dee da dee, and you're not beating through beat 2, which I think is fine, you know, to hold the kind of half note. When you do the next pickup, I would be just a little bit more emphatic, so that there's a feeling for the band that they know we're holding. And what I did like what you did is you didn't go hold and stop. You went hold, but you kept moving. I think that motion, even when you're not beating, is important because it keeps the sound alive. But then the next pickup can be just a little bit more of your body involved in kind of propelling that forward.
Okay.
And the other thing you may want to experiment with when you're not in this frame is this is a very horizontal music. This is a lot like what we were talking about, you know, with the strings, you know, it's very much this kind of smooth thing. In fact, you could even conduct this without necessarily even going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but just 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, kind of like a little figure eights. Whereas 1 is down, which is fine, but the one kind of shape, the space is only like maybe 6 inches tall, so that it's just 1, and then the 2 and the 3 are maybe 2 or 3 feet wide. So there's this real kind of flow, like you're kind of like floating on water as you go through this. Is another thing to kind of keep in your mind. I think you're perfectly able, without overdoing it, to expand the left to right, and then keep the top to bottom nice and small like you're doing. Do it again and try to incorporate some of that, and don't look at the score this time. You know these 16 bars. This is not.
Yeah.
And just try to connect with us best you can, and bring your left hand in a little bit this time as well. You don't have to mirror, but bring it in maybe above or below your beat hand, and just maybe something to show either where you have the longer notes, like the half notes might be a time to bring it in, or if you want to kind of change the shape of what you're hearing, just let your body do naturally what it wants to with the left hand as you're beating.
Okay.
Let me stop you for 1 second. So that was better. That was really nice. One thing that you did, and I don't know if you knew you did it, when you got to the dotted half note tie, you actually rushed through it. So
Yeah.
your next cue was a little, because it was uncomfortable, right? You're just waiting there. Everybody's watching you. So you got to fight through that. And that one, probably those 5 beats is probably a little bit too much to not have any time going. So ba-da-dee. This is where I would use my left hand as the sustaining part, and I would just keep very subtle time here, just so the band knew where, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you can bring them back together for the next upbeat. So you've got the sustain here, you've got marking time here, and then you've got everybody now together coming back in.
Okay.
So that's just one idea. That's not an imperative, but I do think that we need just a little bit of kind of, yes, you know we're here, I know I'm here, and then the action, the action beat, the beat that kind of spurs everybody back in. Do the first 8 bars one more time.
Okay.
Here it is. D, D, da. Yeah, good. And the other thing that you can add to your repertoire, what do you play, Sammy?
Clarinet.
Clarinet. Okay, good. So you're very familiar with breathing. One of the things that I think is very helpful for being a wind player conducting wind bands is that we know what it feels like to play this music. And I think you should embrace that. You should, as much as is possible, without making the sound, we don't make the sound, imagine yourself playing this. So you would breathe in between these phrases. And I think there's nothing wrong with a really demonstrative, da, da, a really demonstrative breath. Not that you would go, but that the band feels you breathing with them. Everybody organically is doing the same thing as one body. And as if you were physically going to play that next phrase. So don't be afraid to breathe. When we're nervous, we tend not to breathe. And that's exactly the wrong approach to connecting with our musicians. So that would be the only other thing I'd add on to that first 8 bars.
Okay.
Wonderful. Good job, Sammy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being willing to go there. And even though everybody didn't get a chance to conduct, I think we as conductors, and Colonel Fettig, maybe you can chime in on this too, and we have to finish class here, but we learn a lot by watching other people conduct and getting feedback while on the podium. And so that's why going to different conducting workshops is really helpful, even though you only might get 10 minutes on the podium per day. I mean, we learn so much by just watching others and seeing what they struggle with, as well as just watching some of the professionals.
No, you absolutely do. I've learned so much of what I would coin my technique, or how I conduct and how I hear and see music by watching other people do it. I think we all as conductors, just as we are as musicians, we are a conglomerate of all of our teachers, of all of the musicians we've admired and listened to. If you love someone's sound, even if you've never studied with them, how can you not in your mind try to emulate that sound? I think it's just a natural thing, and conducting should be no different. And I not only learn physical ideas from different conductors about how to embody music, I learned techniques on how to talk to musicians, how listening to, I love watching other conductors rehearse and how they speak to their musicians. How do they motivate them? How do they inspire them? How do they connect with them without, and getting a high level of execution for them without pissing them off, without making them feel inferior. I mean, the psychology of conducting is such an art form as much as the 1, 2, 3, 4. And there's no right way to do it. I mean, every orchestra, every band is different. Every conductor is different. You've got to be yourself. But the leadership part of it, the communication part of it, and the kind of how to communicate your ideas, that can be learned, and that can be observed. So there is no substitute for seeing as many conductors as you can, talking to conductors, watching other people rehearse their groups. I do that to this day, and it's just such a wonderful way to kind of expand your worldview and your palette as well. So absolutely.
Before we go today, is the Marine Band working on any kind of projects that are upcoming that are really exciting that you'd like to share with us?
Well, we're not doing. I mean, everything we're doing right now is completely made up. I mean, we're in the middle of sharing online stuff, so we've completely revamped our strategy right now. Lots of daily videos from musicians who are quarantining at home and staying safe, and some of them have been really creative. We're getting pretty good at it at this point. And we're doing more of these, as you've seen, all of these conglomerate videos, these montages. We're going to have a couple more of those coming out with 35, 40 Marine Band members playing, and we're putting it all together. And then tons of educational outreach. We've got some performances coming up this next year. We've got our tour in the fall, and then some trips planned for next year. I hope that they will stay intact. I mean, it's still very much up in the air. We're finishing up our Sousa project. So Volume 7 comes out next spring, and that'll be the end of it. We will have recorded and documented 130 Sousa marches at that point, most of which have been released in full score and parts free for people to download. I'm very proud of this project, just having one band, all one document that'll hopefully live on as a resource for educators, and not only learning how to play Sousa marches and the way that we play them and with the musical approach that we play them, but also just learning some marches that people didn't know about. I mean, I had a chance from number 1 to 130. I've been intimately involved in all of these marches and learning them, and a lot of them I never knew existed. And it's been such a cool project to now feel like I'm fully versed on everything that Sousa did in the march form, and discovered some gems that I didn't know about that now we play on a regular basis that haven't been played since the 1970s here. So that's been a really cool thing too. So if you're a march fan at all, and if you are plan to conduct bands as your career, I hope you are a march fan and you are a fan of John Philip Sousa. Check out our website, and you can go to the complete marches of John Philip Sousa on that page, and you can discover hopefully a lot of music that you didn't know.
Courtney's a horn player, and she loves marches.
How is a horn player love marches? You know, one of the things that was said when I brought up this project in 2014 to one of my predecessors, he looked at me sideways and goes, "You understand that's a lot of offbeats for the horns." I said, "I know," and it has been a lot of offbeats. So, but we're almost done. So.
Well, Colonel Fettig, this was absolutely fantastic. I mean, we went in a lot of different directions this morning, and I think we appreciate your time and your wisdom on everything that you discussed with us. And so thank you so much, and it was great to meet you in person.
Yeah, no, it was my pleasure. I really appreciate the invitation. And again, I'm sorry for what you're all going through right now. The only thing I can tell you, and I'm sure that Dr. Butler's told you too, is that this will pass. You'll get back to regular life at some point, and hopefully we'll all be that much more appreciative of what it means to be together and to make music. When those opportunities come to you in the future, whether they're professional or educational, seize them, because I'm living proof that you never know what you're capable of until you go for it. So I hope to see you all in person at some point. If you see us on tour, or I see you at Midwest or anywhere else, please do come up and introduce yourself, and let me know if I haven't met you already that we met on this Zoom call. I'd love to see you and talk to you in person.
Let's take a moment, take a quick picture. Everybody smile at the camera. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Colonel Fettig. Everybody have a great day, and we'll see you soon.
My pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.